I'm sure many of us remember the formula y equals mx plus b, even if it's only out of fear and loathing. Math definitely isn't everyone's favorite subject, and it can be hard staying on the straight and narrow. Here are 3 stories where things didn't exactly line up, and intercepts were made with terror. Our 8th grade math teacher, Mr. O, liked to make us do projects, and we were covering a unit on linear functions. Mr. O kind of went all out, and made us find a real-world example of a linear function and fill out a worksheet. Unfortunately, the project was rather involved, and we had to actually go somewhere outside of our homes to find this example, and take at least one picture to prove that we went there. Mr. O did give us a big hint, and told us that if we found something with an initial cost up front, and then a pay-as-you-go cost after that, then it should count. Unfortunately, there did need to be an upfront cost, so it wasn't like I could just go to a gas station and take a picture of my dad filling up his truck. 2 days before the project was due, I went with my dad to our local hardware store, since we figured there would be an upfront cost for renting some of the tools. My dad wasn't exactly happy that he had to go out of his way on this errand, so I tried to be quick. When we got there, it was around 7 p.m. and there were only a few cars left in the parking lot. We parked and went in, then went to the tool rental area. With my dad standing nearby, I explained how I was doing a school project and needed to find something that would require an initial payment to rent. Luckily, the employee happily obliged me, and mentioned that all of the larger tools and vehicles indeed required such a payment. We ended up going with one of the flatbed trucks, which had an initial rental fee of $30, and then cost $15 for each hour of use for the rest of the day. Therefore, the function would be c of t equals 30 plus 15t, where c was the cost in dollars and t was the time in hours. I actually got to stand on the bed of the truck while my dad took a picture with his phone. The employee thought it was funny. After my dad and I reviewed the picture, I double-checked that I had everything I needed for my sheet before we decided to leave. However, I had to use the bathroom, so we went there first. While we were washing our hands, my dad told me to be quiet. As I pulled my hand away from the sink and the water automatically stopped, I could hear yelling coming from somewhere out in the store. My dad walked over and peeked outside the door, and then closed it quickly and shoved his foot against the side. He told me not to panic and asked me to put my foot on the door as well. For context, there wasn't a deadbolt and we didn't have the key to lock the door. My dad told me there was a man trying to rob the store and he might have been armed. Everything from this moment onward felt completely surreal, and I felt myself start to hyperventilate. The yelling continued, and it sounded like the man was banging the counter with his fists. There was a scuffle and eventually a scream of pain before things fell silent. Another minute or 2 passed before someone knocked on the bathroom door and told us it was safe to come out. It was that same employee from earlier, and he was glad we were all right. When we stepped out, I saw a very large man being held down by 3 other employees. The man was out of breath and wasn't struggling anymore. A couple of things in the store were knocked over too. The cop showed up a moment later and put the man in cuffs before taking him out of the store. Luckily he hadn't been armed, and he hadn't even been trying to rob the store. Apparently the man had come in earlier that day to try to return something, and when he wasn't able to, he got upset and had to be escorted out of the store. I guess he got angrier again, or else thought that maybe a different person later in the day might have given him a refund. The employee who had been helping us was very apologetic and told us that his manager would give us $100 store credit. As my dad and I were all right, that's all he really cared about, though he did accept the offer and said he'd be back another time to buy something. As we rode home, we started to relax a bit and even made 1 or 2 jokes about what happened. I still remember the last thing he said as we got out of the car. I hope you get an A on your project. This happened my freshman year in college, and it is without a doubt one of the scariest things that's ever happened to me. I was taking a statistics class and we were working with scatterplots. Specifically, we had to find the equation of a line passing through the data, also known as a regression line. I know you might be wondering how that could be scary in a literal sense, but just wait. For the particular homework I was working on, we had to download an Excel file. Then we had to use Excel to generate the graph and make the regression line. For some reason, my laptop wasn't working, so I had to go to the student union to use the computers there. It was about 4 p.m. when I got there and started working. I remember I had just opened the course website and downloaded the data file when I noticed a man sitting next to me. He looked to be around my same age, so I assumed he was a student as well. He looked like he had decent hygiene and he was dressed in clean clothes, so nothing about his appearance was immediately off-putting. However, as there were like 30 computers in this one area and almost no one else was here, the fact that the man sat down right next to me was kind of annoying. As I learned throughout high school, guys can hit on girls anywhere, and I suspected that was what he was doing. However, I thought he also might just have had a question and was maybe in my same class. I figured the guy would at least log into the computer and make it look like he was doing something, but instead he just sat there, looking at me. It was very awkward, and however much I didn't want to break the silence, eventually I had to. I turned and asked the man if he needed anything. He stared right back at me and said no, very matter-of-factly. Remember what I said about this being awkward? Well, now it was extremely creepy as well. After that point, I couldn't focus on what I needed to, so I decided to get up and walk around the section of campus for a while before coming back and working on another computer. Before I left, however, I asked the guy what he was working on. In that same tone of voice, he told me nothing. Now I went from creeped out to concerned. I wanted to get away from him, but I was afraid he'd follow me, and I felt super embarrassed and didn't want to get help. Luckily, at that exact moment, one of the people who worked at the student union walked by and asked us if we needed anything. The man sitting next to me just stared at him, but I think the employee could sense I wasn't feeling okay because he stopped and looked at us more intently. He asked if we were both students. I told him I was. The man next to me didn't immediately say anything, so the employee asked him again. At that point, he said yes. Next, the employee asked to see our student IDs, and after I showed him mine, the man said he left his back at his dorm. The employee told him that he'd have to go back and get it, as we needed to have our student IDs on us if we wanted to access the student union services. The man got up and walked out of the building. When he was out of earshot, the employee asked me if that man had been bothering me. I almost started to cry, but instead I just nodded. The employee, who looked to be in his 40s and was very compassionate, apologized and assured me that I'd be okay in the student union. He told me that if that man came back or bothered me elsewhere, to get him or another employee. I was beyond grateful. I decided it was probably best to try to finish my homework now to lessen the chances I'd run into that guy outside. After searching the course website, Googling, and looking at a YouTube video, I finally figured things out and was able to answer the homework questions. I copied and pasted my scatterplot with the regression line into the Word document with my answers, and then I uploaded it. By now it was around 5:30, and I was starting to get very hungry. I'd been periodically checking my surroundings, and so far hadn't seen the man. However, the student union, including the computer area, was a bit more crowded, so it was harder to check. I logged out of the computer and got my backpack. I got up and started walking to the cafeteria/fast food area of the union building. It had a really good sandwich place, and though things were crowded at this time, I got in line. 5 minutes passed and I was about halfway through the line, but then I saw him. That same man was sitting down at a table in the main dining area. He was alone, and he seemed to be just sitting there. It didn't look like he had any food, and he didn't have any school stuff like a backpack or laptop. He wasn't looking at me, but rather just staring off into the distance. I couldn't decide whether or not I should get out of line, but I was super hungry, so I decided to stay in line but turn away from him. That would present a problem, however, since it would be more obvious to check behind me. I kept moving through the line, periodically glancing over at that man. At no point did he get up or even look around. I was sure by now that he had some kind of mental issue. Finally, I was able to order and then stand nearby while waiting. Once I got my food, I looked around, and surprisingly that man was gone. I kept scanning my surroundings, but I didn't see him anywhere. I considered just eating in the main dining area, but even though I couldn't see that man anymore, I was still too sketched out. I decided to take the bag of food with me back to my dorm room, which was on the other side of campus. It would take me about 15 minutes to walk over. I felt my body tense up as I walked outside of the student union building, half expecting that man to be waiting for me by the entrance. But he wasn't there. Things were getting less busy, so I was trying to walk through the main parts of campus so I wouldn't get caught alone. When I was like 5 minutes from my dorm, I heard footsteps in the distance, and instinctively I turned around. I froze when I saw that man walking quickly towards me. He was only like 100 feet away. I screamed, and the next thing I knew, I was running. A second later I heard a yell from somewhere behind me, and when I turned my head, I saw the man was now running in a different direction. There was a campus security officer watching the man, so I figured he had asked the man why he was running, and then the man tried to get away. I started walking back over to the officer, who could tell I was upset. I started explaining out of breath everything that had happened that day, and he told me I'd be alright as he radioed someone and we started walking back to the security office. When we got there, I described again what happened. They were actually able to pull up the man on surveillance footage from the student union and got a reasonably good look at his face. When they searched the student records for someone matching his appearance, they couldn't find anyone. As I suspected when the man didn't show his ID at the union, it seemed he wasn't actually a student. They told me they'd be on the lookout, and that if I saw that man or felt unsafe in any situation, to let them know. After that, an officer escorted me back to my dorm, and when I told my roommate what happened, she freaked out as well. We were both paranoid for a while, me much more so than her, but thank God that man never bothered me again. I've since graduated, and the rest of my college experience was pretty typical. By now I don't think about what happened too often, but it does come up from time to time. After that incident, I started carrying pepper spray, and while I never had to use it, it did give me peace of mind. I know I'll never know who that man was or what he was dealing with, but I do know his intentions weren't good. It just goes to show that something can happen when you least expect it. Back in high school, we had this teacher, Mr. Larson, for algebra. Mr. Larson, or L-Train as we called him, was pretty chill. A lot of the time he'd give us the end of class to start working on homework. His philosophy was that as long as we got our work done and didn't cheat, then things were fine. One day we started a new unit on linear functions, and he gave us a worksheet with a lot of questions. Even though I was able to start it in class, I knew I probably had about 2 solid hours of work to do. We did have a few days to turn it in, but I wanted to get it done sooner because I also had a project for English that was a lot more important. On top of that, my brother had a Little League game that day, and my mom wanted me to come because we'd played baseball together and he really looked up to me. Long story short, I was a total nerd and took my worksheet and a pencil with me to the game. After we got to the park and my brother went to join his team, I walked to a nearby table and took out the sheet. This park had a few of those larger round tables with about 10 seats around it, and in addition to the fields, there were also bathrooms and a playground. About a minute after I sat down and started working, a man came out of one of the bathrooms. He was definitely an older dude and looked to be in his 50s. He had a beard and was wearing a plaid shirt and blue jeans. The man slowly walked in my direction and then stopped about 5 feet away. Personally, I hate it when people try to look over your shoulder, so I turned and said, "Hey." The man replied with, "Hey, what you working on?" I told him it was something for class. The man said I was very dedicated to be working on it at a place like this. I wanted this conversation to end and the man to walk away, so I just said, "It's all good." Unfortunately, the man didn't leave, but instead took a few steps closer. He was literally standing right next to me, reading my paper. "Find the y-intercept," he said, to which I didn't say anything. I think you set y to 0. Well, he definitely wasn't a math teacher, and it seemed like he wasn't getting the hint. I turned to face him directly and said, "I'm good," very matter-of-factly. The man kind of shrugged his shoulders and backed up before walking away. Finally. I watched him walk behind the bleachers as I looked back at my paper. I was able to work through one more problem before my brother's game started, at which point I joined my mom at the bleachers. I didn't tell her about the man who came up to me, but I kept looking around for him. I had expected him to be sitting somewhere in the bleachers, but I couldn't find him. My brother's team won the game, and after a bit of celebration, we walked back to my mom's car. My heart sank into my stomach as I saw that same man from earlier. He was coming out of the bathroom again and started walking over to us. What happened next caught me completely off guard. Before he got to us, he actually called out my name. My mom and brother instinctively looked over to him, and my mom shot me a glance that meant, "Who is this guy?" The fact that he somehow knew my name completely creeped me out, and I didn't want to acknowledge his presence. I kept walking, and my brother and mom came too. When we got back in her car, my mom asked me who the hell that man was. I explained about how I was working on my sheet before the game when he came up to me, and that I had no idea who he was. My mom looked concerned, and I told her we should just drive away. She asked me how that man knew my name, and I honestly had no idea. But then it hit me. He must have seen it on my paper when he was standing over my shoulder. As that fact sunk in, my blood ran cold. I'd written both my first and last name, so that man might be able to track me down. My mom asked me again, and when I told her, she started freaking out. She almost stopped the car. My brother was also becoming afraid, seeing us worried like this. As we drove out of the park and onto the main street, my mom and I noticed a beat-up old pickup truck following right behind us. When it kept following us around the next turn, we both had the same thought. My mom started slowing down, but the truck didn't pass us. She kept slowing down though, and finally when we were almost stopped, the truck put on its blinker and moved over into the other lane. We watched it drive past us, and my mom started going faster again. It got back into the right lane and started slowing down. The road we were on wasn't very busy, so my mom did a U-turn and started heading back towards the park. She made a couple turns onto side roads in an attempt to lose the truck, which seemed like it worked. We only lived about 10 minutes away, but my mom drove around a little instead of going straight home. The whole time I could tell she was terrified, and I was pretty uneasy myself. Maybe my brother was still a little afraid, but he was also having fun with the fact that we were driving all over the town for some reason. Finally, we got back to our neighborhood, and just as my mom turned onto our street, she almost screamed. There, just now pulling into our neighborhood, was that same truck. She sped back to our house and almost hit the garage door as it was still going up. She parked and yelled at me and my brother to get inside as she closed the garage door again. Our dad was home, and when my mother explained what was happening, he grabbed a baseball bat and went to the front door. Sure enough, that truck was there, parked on the street. My dad opened the door and started screaming, and we heard the engine start and saw the truck speed off. My dad walked down to the curb, continuing to scream and wave the baseball bat like a maniac. He watched as the truck rounded the next corner, never to be seen again. For a while, my family and I were pretty paranoid. My parents contacted the police and gave a report, but there wasn't much they could do. We didn't even manage to get the license plate number. My mom called the school and explained the situation to my principal and teachers, and they told her they'd look out for any suspicious people on campus. My mom also insisted that she pick me up instead of me riding the bus, which I was honestly fine with. Now maybe you were expecting that guy to show up again out of nowhere, but he didn't, and this was over 5 years ago now. However, it still freaks me out that he knows my name and where I lived during high school, and I just hope that he never comes after me or anyone else again.